right, well, welcome back, everybody. Good to see you all. So first off, let's get down to business and take a look at the minutes if you haven't already. I'll give you all a moment to do that. The only change I caught is I was called chairman, and I think we just used sort of the gender neutral chair, but otherwise it looked good to me. I'll give everyone else a moment to take a look.
Sorry, that's old AP style.
No worries, no worries.
Okay, if that's it.
So then, does anyone else have any changes or additions they'd like to make? All right, then I'd entertain a motion to approve the minutes.
A motion to approve the minutes.
Is there a second?
Second.
All right, anyone opposed? Nope. All right, motion will carry and they are approved. So next is staff update with Shannon.
Yeah, so in the interest of time, I'm not going to read through the city update to you since I emailed it to you already, unless anyone has objections to that. So are you okay with me giving you ancillary stuff? Okay, cool. All right, so there are two things that I want to draw your attention to in the March news. The first being the state of the city, which will air tomorrow. There's a link in the email that I had just sent that will take you so that you can view that in whatever fashion that you want to. So it is just a video this year, but it's really well produced and it's very cool. So I hope you will watch it tomorrow. It premieres at 10 a.m., but it will be available at any time after that at the same website. Another thing that I want to bring to your attention is in the city manager recruitment, there is a bullet point that mentions that a community survey is going to launch in March that will gather public input on key city initiatives. And I wanted to let you know what those city initiatives are. So the initiatives that they're going to be surveying about are racial equity, housing, COVID-19 recovery, economic development, climate change, and downtown redevelopment. So we should be able to have access to that data when it comes back in, if that's something that y'all would like me to get for you so that you can take that into consideration as you move forward with your vision. And then I also would like to share some updates about events with you because we will be doing some modified in-person events this year. Things are starting to look up with COVID, so hopefully we will even be able to have more people there than we currently think we'll be able to have. But we're going to kick off with the Kurdish New Year celebration that I had already mentioned to you, which is on March 20th. I did check in with them about how many people at that event typically speak English versus people who have English as a second language. And they're confident that people speak English. They are not translating any of their marketing for that event either. So they've recommended that we do not translate our information. Let's see. So the events team this year is going to do a lot of small events rather than some of the larger traditional events that you've seen in the past, like Celebration Parade and Flicks by the Fountain and picnics in the park are not going to happen this year. We are going to replace them with things like paint in the park, which is kind of like a paint and sip, but it will happen once a week over the course of a month. We also want to do a wellness series the following month, which will happen once a week over the course of that month. We have other things that we're going to be doing in the subsequent months. So from May to November, there will be small events that will be occurring in person that we'll be offering. So those will be other opportunities that you might have to do some interaction with the community if you'd like. We're also doing our event with THPRD for Independence Day. We aren't going to do what we have done in the past, but this year we're going to have family-friendly activities that people can be involved with. And so there'll be a variety of things for those. And in August, we are going to do night market in person. And it's going to be a lot smaller this year, probably. But yes, we have figured out how we think we can do this safely in person. We're going to have timed tickets. We're going to have a controlled entry. So people show up at the time that their ticket asks them to. They have a designated amount of time that they get to spend at the market. And then the next wave of folks will come in. So that's how we're going to limit how many people are at the event. Of course, we'll follow all other COVID guidelines, masks and distancing and all of that stuff too. But we're super excited that we're going to be able to do that in person this year. We're also going to do an online thing where it's live streamed. So somebody who is attending the event, probably a DAB member, will go through and live stream their experience at the event so that people who aren't comfortable going in person or aren't able to go in person can experience it somehow anyway online. So that'll be happening. And then we're hoping to bring back Volunteer Fair and Bike Beaverton. They wanted to be in the spring this year and they've postponed it. So now they're both going to be in September just to give them more of a chance to hope that they can have a larger groups involved with that. So fingers crossed that that will happen too, as well as tree lighting. We want to bring back the tree lighting ceremony. So hopefully that will happen again this year too. That also will probably be smaller, but there will be opportunities for you to do outreach in person this year. There are more events. Once we get the event schedule more solidified, I can make that available to you so that you can see the big list of everything and decide what you might be interested in being involved with. And that's all I have for you. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Great, thanks very much. And so
Cool.
then Councilor Fagin's up next.
Well, Shannon got to do the good one with all the events because that was really exciting. She gave that update last night at council, and I think we were all going, yes, we get to go to places again. So I'm looking forward to that, and I think it's great that we're going to be able to do what we can safely and get back together, because that's one of the things I miss most anyway, is the ability to gather as community and just have that casual conversation. So looking forward to that. I have two quick updates. One, well, both of them we got updated on last night at council, so I thought they were timely. The first one is the budget, and as you might expect, the budget has been impacted by COVID. The finance director has been trying since last May to try and forecast what does the current fiscal year look like. Well, I guess I should step back. So the city's fiscal year runs from July 1st to June 30th. So it gets a little confusing because we do budgeting in May, and that's for the budget that takes effect July 1st. So last year, as we were just getting into this, trying to figure out what 2020, 2021 budget year looked like was a real challenge, and staff has done a really good job at estimating, and we're in, for most cities, we're in really good shape. Unfortunately, what that means is for 2021, 2022, they're also trying to do their best forecast, and it means that there is going to be less money available, which means that the budget will just be tightened up. We're still going to be able to do a lot of fun events, and there's still a lot of things that we're going to get to enjoy as a city, and all of the main things that we have to do as a community are going to happen. Beaverton has just been really fortunate where we haven't had to have budget tightening, right? When you compare Beaverton to Portland, Portland had to have pay cuts for all their staff, and we haven't had to have pay cuts, and we haven't had to lay people off, and I don't foresee that that's going to happen. So we're fortunate, but it's going to be a tighter budget this year. This year also is the first year of the budget through the new charter, which means council is going to be more involved at the beginning. So we're starting to get those updates. This year is going to be kind of like a blend of how we did it before and how we're going to do it in the future. But it's good to get some of this early interaction with our city manager on budget priorities, and that's going to be part of council next week, is talking about what each councilor feels should be the budget priorities for next year.
I got a question.
Yeah.
So last year, most likely everybody did a lot less, right, than they did the prior year. I mean, I'm sorry, in the current year, current fiscal year, everybody did a lot less than the prior year, right?
As far as in which
Activities
which-
and expenses are concerned, I guess, is what I'm thinking.
Yeah, so there should be some areas where there'd be carryover in more the travel training and assistance or travel training and assistance area of the budget. I haven't seen what those carryovers are forecast to be. There will be some areas where the city was able to save money because of COVID, but there's going to be other areas where there were larger expenses because of COVID. Like being able to take a workforce of about 600 people and make it so we can work remote safely. That was a challenge. So we haven't seen, well, and then the other side of that is the federal government is is in some of the CARES money, providing money to cities to pay for COVID relief expenses. So the city's been tracking all of that as well. So when we get federal money, we'll be able to offset that. So there are a whole lot of moving pieces, and I honestly haven't seen the full forecast yet. We've just got, last night we had our first really high level spreadsheet view of what 2019-20 looked like, 2020-21 looked like, and 2021-22 could look like.
I have a question.
Yeah.
The money from the federal government or state which is coming from the COVID, you know what the allocation is, how that's getting allocated to the city, what amount we're expecting?
No, I don't. It's a really strange thing. So like in some of the very early CARES money, one of the problems was there was it came to the city. Well, it came from the federal government to the state government to the county government to the city government, and then we had a certain amount of time that we had to distribute it, right? So it was one of these things where, you know, as a city government, we're not set up to rapidly run a grant program, right? Normally, if we're going to run a grant program, we've got time and we know the rules and we have everything set up. With this, it was like done on the fly, and if we hadn't been able to get the money from the city out into the community and the business community, we would have had to give it back to the county. So it's different because all of the money coming from the federal government goes through Congress. The rules are different every time it comes out. Absolutely. So they can give us advice on where they think it's going to come from and what the strings are going to be and what the dollar amount's going to be, but we just don't know until it's through. And then you got to get the state to go through and do what they're supposed to do, and then the county. And so by the time it gets here, we take what we can get and we're happy for it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions on budget? Okay. The other one I wanted to bring up, and I'll put a comment or a link in the chat for you. We had an update last night on what we're calling a housing options project. So the state a year or two ago put a law in place that said throughout Oregon, you cannot have single family resident zoning. That if you have detached single family home zoning in any residential area, you have to have it opened up to multiple types of zoning. So we're doing what's called a housing outreach project, and a lot of work has been done on it already. We had a really good update on it yesterday. I have some concerns about how it's going to impact our neighborhoods, because that's really where it's going to hit. Neighborhoods that have CC&Rs aren't going to be impacted because the state law can't change what the CC&Rs say. Neighborhoods that don't have CC&Rs will be impacted. So that concerns me, because the neighborhoods that don't have CC&Rs are typically our older neighborhoods. And sometimes those neighborhoods have the more affordable housing in Beaverton, if you want to call the housing in Beaverton affordable. So it's really important that we get as much community input as possible on basically the future redevelopment of the city, trying to add more homes that are smaller, that are accessible for everyone is something we want to do. We just want to make sure we do it right. And typically this would be a really neat outreach project where you go to the library and there would be multiple easels set up with a whole lot of different examples, and you could mill about the room and you could talk to staff about what this meant and how does it implement and what could it mean to my neighborhood or my neighbors. That's not going to be able to happen this year. So they're going to have to do it virtually and do it with surveys. And I wanted to let all of you know because it is critical to our community and what it's going to look like over the next 5, 10, 20 years. So I'll put that link in the chat. And then when you have a chance, if you're so inclined, take a look. And if you have any questions, I'm always here as a resource to answer anything.
Could you define what CCNRs are and how and which kind of neighborhoods have those already?
Yeah, so typically, Amy, when housing developments got put in, there were covenants, I just lost the word, conditions, covenants, and restrictions. Yeah. And what it would do is it would define what the lot, what you could develop on each lot in that subdivision. And the enforcement of those is left up to a homeowners association. So if there's an active homeowners association in the neighborhood, their CCNRs are in effect. If there's not an active homeowners association intact, then the CCNRs are not enforced. So some CCNRs can be that you can only have single family homes on the lots. Some change the setbacks from what the city requires to what the homeowners association or the development requires. There are things like you can't put fences in your front yard. You can't paint your house a certain color. There are all kinds of rules depending on how it was set up when the area was subdivided. Does that help?
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like you were casting it as though doom and gloom for any neighborhood that doesn't have one already. So I just wanted to define what it was. So thanks.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make it doom and gloom. It's just a concern because we hear from neighbors where there's a development like in an empty lot behind them, and it's like a single story neighborhood, and they put in 3-story houses. And then the people that align that kind of lose some privacy because line of sight from the houses that get built behind them into their backyards. That's just one of the common things as a council person we get emails about and get phone calls about. So it's really important that we get as much of the community involved in adding their input. It's not something that we have a yes or no answer to. It's we have a how do we make this work for our community.
I do have a question. CCNR supersedes the state requirements. Is that correct?
Because the CCNRs were established before, yes, they can't go back and change the rules after it's been established. Okay. But so because we're doing development in South Cooper Mountain and Cooper Mountain, right, as that comes on, those neighborhoods will have any CCNRs they put in place will have to go through and uphold the current state law.
No, what my question was, so it's like a race to finish line. So if the CCNR is written before the law, then CCR supersedes. Is that correct?
That's my understanding, yes, but I'm not a property attorney, so that's just what that's what I've come to understand. Yeah.
Thank you.
I have a question because the city is looking at doing surveys of people to gauge how they're feeling about the different housing options and this and then knowing that we're going to be surveying people as well. Has the council voiced any concern about survey fatigue of community members at all?
I don't think specifically. I mean, we've talked in general and we've talked about different projects about just regular fatigue of input and participation. So Shannon provided an update to council last night on events. And one of the comments that came out of that was, last fall when we were trying to do a lot of virtual events, there was just general fatigue about Zoom, right? I mean, we get tired of being on the screen. So yeah, there is going to be a lot of outreach going on for individual projects this spring, this summer. I mean, it's one of the things the city has learned from visioning is that the more robust the outreach, the better the result of the project. So whether it's a housing option study or something completely unrelated, if the city works to engage the community as best possible, the outcomes of each project are better. So I think regardless of the outreach that the VAC does, there's always going to be the city trying to do it. And there might be times where the VAC can help with that. I know some of the questions we got in the first go around was city council was deciding whether they were going to put in a minor league baseball park on what was Westgate, which is now a hotel and apartment buildings, right? And the comments that we got were, yes, baseball, no baseball. I hate baseball. I love baseball. And it was really interesting because you kind of tally them up as people came by, and we weren't asking whether they liked it or not, but staff was able to use that information to inform at that point the mayor and kind of the development team as to what the community was thinking about it. So I think there'll always be projects going on where the city's doing outreach. I think right now in COVID, everybody's got fatigue of some sort. Hoping that with the vaccinations and by summertime, we'll be able to be out and about a little bit more and that fatigue will lessen.
It would be nice if there are all of these different surveys that go out. This is something that we could talk about as a group, but it would be nice to include something about visioning just as a plug to, if you'd like to contribute or if you'd like to connect with us about the visioning, or just something to maximize those surveys to maybe be able to reach different audiences, people that would be concerned about housing, making sure that we're including them in the discussions. You may capture some different participants in different surveys that you're doing. Just an idea.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's right. And working with Shannon and staff, I think making sure that you're aware of all the other outreach that's going on and that the other outreach teams are aware of what you're doing and what the schedule is. I think that makes perfect sense.
For many of those, we're also able to get that data. And so we can incorporate that data into our vision research as well, if you want to do that. I do want to address Amanda's question in the chat, which is there a way to maybe partner with the NACs to get feedback and input from the community? Absolutely. There's a way for us to partner with any of the boards and commissions that you might be interested in partnering with, and I would really recommend that, actually. So if we could look into that at some point in one of our meetings and who we might want to partner with and how, we can definitely get that underway.
Yeah, I was specifically referring to the housing options project. It was talking about like trying to figure out how to reach out to people, and we wouldn't be able to do something at the library like normal, but thinking about to engage the NACs and reach out to them, and maybe they can help organize their community or do a special section of a meeting or something. Because I know in the Central Beaverton NAC, whenever we're talking about development of any kind, we get a ton of people that show up. So thinking if that was something that was a coordinated agenda item, that at least in that neighborhood, you might be able to hear from people in a way that might be similar to catching them at the library and getting to talk to a staff member.
Yeah, the NACs will and are very important to the outreach that staff does. They'll be at every NAC talking and being on the agenda so that the neighborhood knows ahead of time. It's just part of how we do outreach.
Just want to review the chat again. If you have a question, if you could put up your raise hand instead of putting your question in the chat so that we can call on you and you can ask that question. That's a lot easier for the flow of the meeting. And if we could try and just reserve the chat for links and things that actually need to be written, that would be great. Thanks.
Yeah, and Amy, Cynthia put the link in the chat. So
Oh, because that's actually
I-
not the link to it talks about the whole project, and I
Right.
looked on that and I didn't see the survey. That's why I asked whether there was a survey, and that
Not
was
yet.
just following up on what was already said. So I didn't think
Yeah.
that was background conversation. Sorry, Shannon.
No. This is the link is what's coming, and I just wanted to make sure everyone was aware that this was coming, and I wanted to make sure it got on everyone's radar.
There are links inside that'll take you to the surveys, I think, or the survey reports, I think. If you want to check it out. Also, is that report current or recent? Because there's a project timeline given there, and I wondered if COVID it reflects the changes or modifications of the timeline because of COVID.
Yeah, it's a little bit off. Let me see. If you take a look, let me see if I can pull up the presentation from last night at the current timeline.
While you're looking for that, I will mention that you can find the recording of last night's council meeting, and you could see that entire presentation and then the councilors asking questions about it after too, if you'd like to go into further depth on the housing options project.
Yeah, so the current timeline shows them starting engagement in the spring of 2021 into the summer. They're going to come up with a preferred approach that they'll bring to council again at a work session. And then once they finalize it, they'll start working on comprehensive plan changes and development code changes. And we're all under a state deadline of basically 1 year from June. We have to have all of that work done and all of the comprehensive plan and development plan changes approved and through all of the necessary boards it has to go through. So that was all I had. Sorry it went longer, but I'm always like answering questions. So
I know that questions are great, and it's 7 o'clock now, so we're still right on time. So that's great. Okay, next, going back to the retreat. First off, thank you all again for coming to that. Now in the course of a month, we've had sort of 3 instead of 2 meetings, so that's good, but we got a lot accomplished. In addition to the goals we had talked about previous to the retreat, at the retreat, there were some other goals we discussed. I was going through those and we were able to get through most all of them except for a few. And I think the few that are left over can be answered if I share the PowerPoint that I have developed from that with Sarah's sort of jumping off point. Let me share my screen. Okay, and then I'll do slideshow. All right, can you all see that well? Okay. So of the goals that we had, the few that we didn't accomplish or didn't fully accomplish was 1, walking away with something tangible, but I think this PowerPoint will hopefully satisfy that at least in part. And then 2, developing a rough calendar for how we want to approach the visioning process. And I put one into here that we can talk about. So before I go through this, some context. As we mentioned previously at the retreat, we're going to have an opportunity to present to the council and speak with them on March 30th and have a roundtable about what we're going to do. So we don't have a whole lot of time there, but I want to have enough information to sort of refresh the council, but also anyone who might be watching online as to who we are, what we do, and what we are planning to do next. So we'll just walk through the slides and then talk about them as we go through them. So anyway, first off, sorry, my mind's I'm a little less organized than usual tonight. But first off, Sarah grabbed this screenshot. I think we can grab one tonight that'll be with everyone prepared and then put that in. It might be a little bit better because normally we'll take a group photo halfway through the year, but with COVID, we haven't had live meetings, so we hadn't done that. And I think it'd be great for people just to see folks' faces. First off, who we are. I have a series of responsibilities, and you might have your Zoom box in the way like mine is, but if you pull it, you can click and drag that to the side so you can see. And I pulled these 3 things from our bylaws that say this is what we're supposed to be doing, right? Promoting community involvement, developing the action plan, and then going back to the city council and staff to figure out how we enact it and when we need to update it. So then what do we do, right? And Sarah found this, and I think it's just great. We already had this made up on the website. This is the history of the visioning process. And I think it's going to be really interesting for folks to look at because you notice it began in 2007 with the first vision adopted in 2010, and then updates coming out in 15, 16, right? And so we're very much due for an update again, if not a full refresh of the community vision. But then in case anyone's wondering, do we really need this? I thought about it, and actually we've had a lot of changes since 2015. Even just locally, the development of some commercial districts are hugely different since 2015, especially in Old Town and the Round, but then also in Northwest Beaverton, there's been a lot of growth out there. Housing and population growth, I mean, hundreds, probably thousands, but I saw lots of stats in the hundreds, so I don't want to change it, but hundreds of new units, and I think the population's increased by like 4,000 to 5,000 folks. And also we have our city's looking different. We have new public buildings. Thinking back to the move of City Hall, that was completed in just August of 2014. And so really the last time we reached out to people, Beaverton was a lot different. But then also nationally, we've had 2 incredibly notable presidential elections that have shaped the way people think about community. Colin Kaepernick and BLM all started in 2015, 2016. The marriage equality decision was in 2015, 2016. The discussion around gender and pay equity and Me Too, and of course, COVID. I mean, we live in a really different world than we did back in 2015. And then we took the goals from the retreat. One is that we wanted to hit a broad section of the population, 8 to 10%. 2, focusing out, this was a tricky one to figure out how to word because of our discussions last time. So I want to stay on this for a moment to talk about it, make sure we all feel comfortable with this. But I thought a good way to word what we were talking about is to focus outreach efforts to ensure that traditionally underrepresented groups have had their voices heard. And the reason I said this, because that was a huge focus of our conversation, right? Is to make sure that folks who traditionally don't necessarily get their voices heard become a part of the process. But then also, and this was something Councilor Fagin pointed out that I thought a lot about, we're also looking at different ways to gather information that may not come with demographic data and may be hard to measure. And also if we're getting information from other surveys, whether it's THPRD or this housing outreach survey, all sorts of things, we may not have the demographic data we need to say we know where everything's coming from. And so with that, I think rather than set targets of percentages, I think it needs to be putting an emphasis in terms of how we do everything. And then also, in addition to that, remembering where we get ideas from, because it may be that there are certain ideas that come more from the communities that we don't hear from as frequently, but then those might get shouted out when we look at the full surveys, because communities we hear from a lot are participating multiple times, perhaps in multiple ways. And so just making sure that we know where we're getting ideas from, so we're incorporating ideas from all segments of our community. And also I wanted to use the term traditionally underrepresented because I think it's important to talk about all sorts of groups, obviously race and ethnic backgrounds, but also disability status, gender and sexual orientation, all sorts of issues like that I think all sorts of demographics like that need to be accounted for. Before we move forward, and we'll go back to this whole thing in total, but before we move forward, do people have other thoughts on this? Because I know that figuring out what language to use here can be difficult.
Brian, I just want to say thank you. You took kind of all of our thinking and put it into a really, really clear format. And I especially like the slide before this about the last time we did it and now. I think that's really, really important to point out as to why we need to do this outreach. I love the way you've worded this. It makes a lot of sense. I think we still need to define what we're saying when we say traditionally underrepresented. And I think you just did. I think it's race, I think it's gender, I think it's, you know, ableness. So I think it's important to say it the way you did, but then also define it, because I think we're going to be asked about it.
I agree. And one thing I ask you and everyone else too, do you think that's something we want to have defined written out, or is that something that we should talk about orally? You know, 'cause obviously for me, my bias when it comes to making PowerPoints is very few words. I like to sort of put up the bullet points and then have talks. That way people have to concentrate on what I'm saying, and I'm not reading the slide. But if that's something we want to emphasize, which and maybe it is, and that can be good too, to make sure we have all those things written out so people can see it. What are folks' thoughts about that?
I echo with Sarah, and I would like to be defined because this.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll go the other way. I think from a presentation standpoint, I think it makes sense to have few words, and especially since we want it to be so inclusive, you're going to list so many, and that's a great discussion point to generate some conversation around.
And I believe this is.
I agree with Amanda as well. Just with knowing your audience and then talking, I think you can talk about it and then, but having the general statement, because the other thing is if we list them and then if we don't, let's say we miss a group, or, you know, I mean, you're going to miss a group that's going to be a given.
Brian, can we go to full screen with people's faces while we have this discussion?
Yes.
So
there.
I agree with the, who said that? I think Amanda and Christina, you know, I believe this is going to be an evolving thing, and we'll always find new segments and new way to group things and segment and categorize. So we need the definition, I think, for our committee, but maybe perhaps not for the presentation.
I think I'm in favor of listing as examples, but I think we need to be careful about who we list, because some of those that we list would not be traditionally underrepresented necessarily. So we may list some group that is commonly represented, or at least is commonly referred to, or in some one person's opinion, they might say, wait a minute, my group wasn't represented, but that group always gets represented. And it's that kind of caution I think we need to be careful about. I'm in favor, as a teacher, I'm in favor of providing examples so that it gets people's thinking, so long as we have this opening for, we want to hear what other kinds of groups might be out there, like bicycle riders or.
I do think that those, like, giving the examples can be spoken. And with PowerPoints, it can be death by PowerPoint. If you put everything in the kitchen sink in your PowerPoint and then you get stuck to reading it, and then it's not as pleasurable as an audience member, or as, like, you have to know who your audience is. And then, so I think that you can have those examples, but they can be spoken, and then you keep that more general statement.
Yeah, I think I agree with what people are saying, but I also don't want to lose the importance of this, because to me, a big part of this time around is really decentering whiteness. Like, that's just how I'm thinking of it. And I want to say that really clearly, and I want that to be a focus. And so, I mean, I think maybe I get what you're saying about presentations and words on the slides, but maybe it's another slide, right? Maybe the next slide is, what do we mean when we say not traditionally represented? And say, we're not talking about bicycle riders. I don't care about bicycle riders in this, right? Like, I'm talking about, like, I'm talking about race. I'm talking about the LGBTQ plus community. I'm talking about this, you know, so, and I think we need to be really clear. And I don't think it's an ongoing list. I mean, I think let's define it and let's stick with that. But maybe I'm not thinking as broadly as some of you. So
And
I agree with you, Sarah. And I would also say, like, you know, maybe someone calls us out on something we did miss, and I think that's great. Like, I think we should put out what we're thinking, and if someone in council says, hey, what about, like, let's say we didn't include like the people who are houseless, and someone says like, hey, what about people who are going through houselessness? Like, I think being called out on that is valuable to us, so that we make sure we are thinking about, you know, who aren't we seeing?
And the way Sarah said it, she said very eloquently, really. She literally represented my words. That's what I wanted to say, but the way she said it probably couldn't be said better. At the same time, my thought is that if we don't define, if we don't exemplify, then it will be lost in the translation. And then our focus should be that what we're trying to accomplish. And these are the realities, these are the goals we're trying to accomplish. So we have to focus, we have to somehow define in this conversation.
I want us to, oh, sorry, I'll
go
just
ahead.
throw in, okay. I want us to define at least some for this presentation. I'm not sure that we can choose everything that we want to make sure that we have tonight. That I don't know if we have enough time for that. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. But I do think at least like we need to, within our vision action plan, define those. And then even moreover, then use those as tags in whatever database we have, so that any of these like inputs we can use, we can go back and we can find who said that thing. So if we're defining them as important groups that we need to talk to, our data has to be tagged so we can search it and get their voices and pull it back up.
And Amy, I appreciate that comment, because it's very similar to what I was about to say. So I'll just dovetail off of that, and that I agree that, so tonight we don't have time to sort of walk through. I think that's like an agenda item of its own to walk through. When we're talking about underrepresented in certain groups, we want to make sure we're focusing on what is that. My thought is, it sounds like most folks want some more content here on the slide, and I think that's fine. My inclination would be to make a new slide like Sarah suggested, and then and do lists with broad categories that we can talk about. Socioeconomic status, right? That includes, you know, folks across the income spectrum, whether they're housed or unhoused, right? Things like that. Or maybe it's socioeconomic status, housing status, because you have people who own their homes, people who rent. I'll think through some of those categories. My inclination is going to be to have a second slide, since it is such a focus of what our group wants to do, and have a list of those very broad categories. Does that make sense to folks?
And it could be gender.
Could Sarah help with those? Can she?
Oh, absolutely.
What she
Yeah,
said?
Sarah,
yeah, no,
Sarah's point is really important, in that if we specifically are going to seek some of those unrepresented groups, then that's an intentionality that we should make clear.
Exactly.
We're not just going after economic status. We're not just going after, but we are specifically seeking to get information from these particular groups. And if that's our intention, I think we should say it.
I think that's what we're planning to do, right? Am I misunderstanding?
Well, when you listed categories, you listed socioeconomic status, housing status, but those are just like, here are some examples. But Sarah's talking about an intent statement. Our intention is to devote extra attention, extra time and effort to find these other groups. That's a different comment than just listing what groups we're thinking about.
So that way, and the reason I know you want to do the group view, but I think it's going to be helpful to share this. That's what I was trying to get at with this statement here.
I think the missing link between what you two are saying is that people who are underrepresented because of their particular socioeconomic status or housing status. That makes sense?
Racial identity. I mean, there's a lot more than just those two things. So
those were just the examples.
Yeah.
This is actually one of the reasons why I didn't want to write things onto the slide, because then I you know, the whole point is, because I think we have a general idea of who we're talking about when we say people who are traditionally underrepresented, and by that I mean folks who generally don't have a voice, at least historically, or much of a voice in the process. The people who have to rely on advocates outside of their group to have their voices heard historically in the process, and bringing those people to the front so they can assert their own voices within the process. And in general, that's people, right, as we've discussed before, with various racial and ethnic minorities, people who are further down on the economic ladder, people who have less of a perceived stake in the community because they rent instead of own, or because they're houseless, people who are discounted in employment and housing because of their ability status, people who are looked at as other from the mainstream because of their sexuality or gender identity, right? I think that's what we're trying to capture here. That's really hard to do in a PowerPoint, which is why I think if we're gonna, and hearing this discussion, we need to put it up there, right? That's what I think the group wants, and I think that makes sense given this discussion. But that's why I think a different slide is merited. And then when we're going with a different slide, there are limitations because the slide is only so big. And so what is the best way to display that in a way that's consumable? And that's why I was thinking to do broad categories. That way we can have those broad categories and we can discuss them if the council wants to. But also, and Shannon, please jump in here if I'm misunderstanding, but I think we only have 20 minutes or something like that. Right, so I'm really hoping, and there are a few more slides to get through. And at the end, we have an opportunity to ask the council for something, and that is going to be for the budget and approval of the plan. And also to ask them some questions. And I wrote down some of the questions we came up with, and I can't for the life of me find that particular piece of paper. I have all the other pieces of paper. I came up with a question myself, but I want to get your questions you all might still have too on that slide. And so I think the bulk of the discussion with council is not going to be about who we're trying to reach out to. And I think it's important for us to emphasize that, but our time with the council, that 20 minutes, I'm hoping the slideshow is maybe 6 of that 20 or a little bit more.
What you and Sarah come up with, I would completely trust given this conversation. Between the two of you, you're going to find wording that is satisfying. My only comment would be that we not present ourselves as if we know all these groups. The 12 of us do not represent all these groups. Right. And so we want to make sure that somehow on that slide it says we are seeking to include these groups, even if they may not be listed in this list, that we're presenting ourselves with an openness. That's the thing that I hear from this discussion.
And I was kind of thinking along those lines where I don't think this conversation's over. I think we've hit on something that as a group, we need to explore and define ourselves. And I think what council needs to know is we have an intent to do things differently, and that we're going to do that, right? Like Brian said, we don't want to put a percentage because we know our outreach has to be different. So I think we can explain that, and I think we say that our, some kind of intent statement. And then I think as a group, we need to dedicate some time to really define what are those areas that we want to make sure that we're reaching out to, and then how do we measure it? Because it's not going to be a percentage, but we have to measure it somehow to make sure that we're being true to ourselves. So Brian, I think you're hitting on something where we don't have to go deep in this council session on that.
Okay, so for the purpose of moving this forward a little bit, at least for now, we can always come back if we've got some more time. I think what I'm taking as the directive from the group on this topic is we're going to make another slide. Sarah and I will be coordinating about this because we'll be giving this presentation together. I'll just, Sarah, between us, I'll create a new slide tonight or by the end of the weekend. Yeah, Wednesday, by the end of the weekend, and send this over to you and we can email back and forth. Okay, cool. So let me go back to sharing the screen. So then the next point I had was, let's see if it'll come up. There we go. Now this is a point I wanted to make because of the discussions that we'd had a little bit in this group, but also that Sarah and I had with Cece and Shannon. which is that there's some institutional momentum toward projects that are already underway. If you look at the last update from 2018, only 15% or so of the project of the vision action items have been fully completed, and the rest are either things that are constantly ongoing, like expanding access to fill in the blank, or things that are just projects underway. And so making it clear to the council and to the city that we respect and value all the information we've gathered before, but also it's time to listen to the community again. And if that means doing something new, we're very open to that, and we think we should. And then finally, developing a final product to be useful for the city council and staff. Ultimately, this is what we need to do, because otherwise all this work will be for naught. So those are the 4 major goals I had. I think within these categories, we have sub goals. And I think from our discussions, there are also a number of other goals that are maybe subsidiary to these, but I think these are probably our 4 chief goals. Does anyone have anything they want to augment on here? Is there something important that's been left out? Okay, so next, proposed timeline. And this is me spitballing based off of the conversations that we've had. So jump in here if we want to adjust our proposal to the council. So between now and July, we want to involve the city staff. That's already underway through Shannon. Thank you very much, Shannon. Finish planning the outreach process. And I think we're going to need an agenda item to talk about what we mean about underrepresented, underserved populations for outreach. Issues like that, deciding all those big picture questions before we get the ball rolling. Taking advantage of outreach opportunities in the meantime. So like the Kurdish event that we have coming up and the one at the Baptist Church previously. Securing a budget, and then releasing an RFP for consultants. So that way in August, we can really hit the ground running. I think in August and November is when I anticipate doing the first round of outreach. Then have a couple of months to evaluate that, followed by a second round of outreach, and then a few months to evaluate it, and then prepare the community vision for city council approval. So ultimately that takes us into December of 2022, really far from now in some ways. What do people think? And I'll give you, this is the first time you all are seeing this, obviously, so let everyone take a moment, and I'll go back to the view where we can all see each other thinking and chewing on these ideas and see what you think. Or would it be helpful to have it still up, actually? It would be, wouldn't it? Yeah, because I'm the only other one who can see it right now. So we'll do that. Sorry, everybody.
The only thing that jumps out to me right away is like the time to evaluate the second round and then prepare the vision for the city seems a little bit truncated, like pretty short compared to the rest of the timeline. It seems like, I'm not sure if we could do it in 3 months, but I've never created the plan, so I'm not sure.
Now, 3 slides earlier when you showed the timeline of the historic timelines, weren't you saying that something's due this year?
Yeah, well, this would be the year here. Let me go back. We can take a look at it. Let's see. Let's jump back.
I would also wonder whether just December, January, just those 2 months to evaluate the first round is enough time. Given that we meet only monthly, that seems like that's asking a lot to do for an evaluation. Because I would defer to maybe the consultant. They may have techniques that allow us to be more efficient. But
that was the thing that jumped out to me as well, especially since that's holiday time. It might be harder to get people. I feel like that would be a time where we might need to do another retreat or two. And that might be a challenging time to do that kind of work.
I would like to point out, because this is important, that we will not even know whether or not we have a budget for a consultant until July. And so it usually takes about 2 to 3 weeks to create an RFP, which we wouldn't be starting until July. And then after that, it takes about 2 to 3 months for that whole RFP process to be completed, depending on how much money we're asking for.
2 to 3 months?
So yeah, government procurement takes a long time.
What
but
about this
I would-
cycle's budget for VAC? Do we know how much? We're not spending any on food, right? For instance.
Well, we'll get to the specifics of that in a minute. I want to concentrate on the timeline. But yeah.
Okay. So
no.
Yeah. So here, when you said 2021 outreach and update, you weren't expecting that to be the.
Right. So originally, I think when this document was prepared, everyone's thinking either in 2020 or 2021 is when we go back out to the people then publish. But obviously with COVID and everything, we're behind schedule a bit.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry. Can we just go back, Shannon, to your point? My assumption was that we go to council in March and they give us the green light because they're like, this is amazing. You guys are right. We need to do this. Yes. Let's get some information. They're going to say yes. And so that's enough confirmation to know that money will be in the budget so that we start preparing the RFP and that's the 3 months. And then August, July, we hit the ground running with them. Is that not?
Can I also add to this question? Because Cece also said that there was something in the supplemental budget already. So I'm not sure.
Okay, what's in the supplemental budget already that we're asking for is a project manager, which we would also love for you to mention in your PowerPoint to City Council, that is something that's already been asked for in the budget. Just because you get the green light from council doesn't mean that green lights the budget. That's a separate thing. And so it's possible that you could be green lighted by council and then during the budget processes that would not be approved. I think we can optimistically say that probably we'll get what we asked for in the budget. And so to your point, Sarah, I think that if we want to put in the effort to do the RFP without knowing for certain whether or not we're going to actually have that budget, we can start working on that earlier to make the process go a little bit quicker. Also, I want to mention that as of now, from what I understand, you're planning to ask for $100,000 for a consultant in the budget. That means that council wouldn't need to approve the RFP process in order to send that out into the world for people to be able to submit their proposals, which also makes it go faster. So really more realistically, we could do a 2-month RFP process rather than 3 months, but it still will be at least 2 months before we're able to get all of that information back and hire a consultant or whomever you decide to hire.
But
Does that make
something
sense?
We can begin in June and then we have completed by August?
Potentially, yeah. Yeah.
And I am sorry if I seem a little antsy about this, but I think for me and some of the folks who've been on this committee a while now, we've been sort of each year we get this false start that we're going to get going, and so I think we're just a little bit ready to go. But if we need to pull back, then there are certain constraints we can't avoid.
Except that, Brian, summer is going to be prime time for outreach.
Right.
So I don't want to miss that window. That's
right.
That's the only reason. I mean, aside from the antsiness. But.
Well, this may be a little bit of a wild idea, but what if we did the best we could with our outreach this summer and fall, and think of the consultant as coming in for the second round of outreach and really do a much more intensified version of outreach using the consultant during that second time?
So
Wade,
we talked about was having multiple consultants, and one area where I think the consultants can be particularly helpful is in crafting the various questions that we have. To get the types of answers, or not the types of answers, but to get people to think about questions the way we want them to and provide answers that'll be useful.
The city already has resources and people that we're connected to that we're able to use to craft survey questions and to actually administer surveys and to compile data and analyze data. And that includes data that you would be collecting in person. You would be able to give that to the company that we use, and they would be able to process that data along with whatever data we collect online. So we do have things in place that would allow us to move forward with outreach and with crafting what you want to do for your survey questions in the initial survey outreach part. And then a consultant might be able to come in and talk to us more about questions that are more specific to the initial data that we've received.
The other
so just to make sure I'm hearing you correctly, Shannon, then in theory, we don't need an RFP to get started with a consultant to help us craft questions, right?
It's not a consultant though.
Well, but I mean, I'd say we don't need a consultant, right?
Right.
Because we have
Correct.
someone in-house or someone on retainer who can do that.
Yes.
Okay.
The other advantage
so then that doesn't impact this timeline, right?
Right.
Okay.
The other advantage of using the consultant for the second round is that we could then hire a consultant specifically with the purpose of getting at those traditionally underrepresented groups. And that might be helpful of getting a consultant specifically for that purpose. And they will have the data of what we did with the first round to then come back in the second round to catch those that we missed.
I agree. And I think that's
Brian?
something that we should discuss when we have more conversations about planning the outreach process between now and July. But I really want to keep this conversation focused on the specific timeline. And I heard concerns about whether we have enough time in the evaluation phase. I think that makes sense, especially, you're right, I didn't think about the holidays in December and January and how that can impinge on that. So I think that's something we should adjust. Do people have other concerns about this timeline?
I just have a question.
My concern
oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. My concern or question, I guess, is what's the difference between your first round and your second round of outreach?
So from my understanding of our conversation at the retreat, and anyone welcome to jump in and correct me if I'm misunderstanding this, is that the first round, the goal would be to go particularly broad. And that's where we want to capture a lot of people's opinions on a lot of things, and then take what we learn in there and then use that to then have more targeted questions into the second round and dig into the issues. That's the takeaway I got from our retreat.
Well, based on this discussion about consultants and underrepresented groups, then I would see the difference between the first and second round is we would specifically use the second round with the intent of addressing those concerns that Sarah mentioned during that previous discussion and making sure we get those underrepresented folks.
So how it worked the first time and the second time the vision was worked on was the first round of outreach was to collect ideas. What do people want to see? How do they, what's missing in the community that we need to add? And those are just answers and ideas. And then the, what do you call it? Evaluation. So you're evaluating the first round to go to the second round. In that evaluation stage, those ideas were turned into themes or actions, right? So then those actions were built on the ideas of the community. The second round of outreach before, or in the past, was to take those action items and bring them out to the community to say, did we hear you? Did we get it right? Or did we miss anything? And that validates that what you heard turned into an item that could then be actionable, that could then go into the plan. So it was gather as much information as possible and then make it into an actionable item, which is how we got all the different items. I think we had 146, maybe 54 or something like that the first time. And then in the second stage of outreach, you had to eliminate some of them, or we didn't eliminate them. We put them in a holding list, but they didn't make the plan. Yeah, I could go on this for a long time, but I'll stop there. So I just wanted to make sure I understood what you meant for first and second round.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
Can I add something? It sounds like if we were to follow what Mark has outlined, that we might be missing the ideas that come from the underrepresented groups by doing this first one. We get broad and whoever answers, and then turning those into solutions. Like, we don't want to come with the pre-baked solutions to those communities and say, like, do you like our solutions? So they need to definitely be part of the outreach in the beginning and knowing that we're trying to reach them, and be able to create solutions that are our final ones that we put in the plan.
Amy,
the really cool part about that first stage is, as a group, you come up with as many different places to go as you possibly can, and as many different organizations as you possibly can. And then when you're at those organizations, one of your last questions is, who else should we be talking to? And then you end up with some new people that you've never even heard of that are meeting in, the library every month, and we didn't even know they were there. And so then you try and get into those meetings to get information from them, and it just kind of leads down a path. So you set up your first pass, which is a bunch of brainstorming as a group of where are all these organizations and how do we talk to them. You're meeting with people in the community, maybe individually, to get those lists built of what organizations should we make sure we sit down and talk to. And then when you get to those groups, you're asking them, who else should we be hearing from? And you get a whole nother list. It's fascinating and fun, and one of the things I like the most about visioning.
Yeah, I see that whole thing as maybe multiple passes of the first round. I think one of the key things we would get from evaluating the first round is to see what the underrepresentation is, or what, because some of it, even if we compare it from 5 years ago or 10 years ago, some of the changes we see from then to what we see as the representation in the first round could be just changes in the demographic over these 10 years or 5 years. So truly looking at what we get back after the first round, and doing some evaluation of what we see, what the underrepresentation is based on how we categorize the various attributes that we define representation in, and then look at, okay, what did we miss here, and then have the more targeted second round focused on those.
Yeah,
with same kind of questions, and then maybe do that next thing where you guys did before, of going back and saying, okay, these are the solutions we came up with. But at that time, we can go to all of the people that had given us. So the first round of representation plus the more targeted representation, we could go to all of them with that second or the next wave of, this is what we heard, is that right?
Cynthia, you've had your hand up for a while. What did you want to say?
Hey, y'all. First of all, a Zoom tip: if there's two little lines on the right hand edge of your PowerPoint, and if you just drag it over, you will then see everyone. So if you just go and do that, magic. Also, I work with 5-year-olds, so I kind of need to see all the things. And the other thing is, I wonder if we are just burying ourselves in the weeds before we even get started. I kind of wonder what would happen if Brian just shared the whole presentation with us, and then we had some time to think about it, and then we talk big picture. We're talking which door are we gonna knock on, and that might not be our discussion point this minute. We'll fight over which block we're gonna knock doors on in a couple months. So that's all I had to say.
I have a question for you specifically, Cynthia. So the DEI plan, you just did outreach recently, right? And was that focused to traditionally underrepresented groups? And is there data that we can use from that plan that might help inform some of the decisions that we're making?
Yeah, I think we all, at our gut level, we all know, we all know how to do it, right? Who do we know who has access to specific communities, and then go for it? What government institutions are frequented by the biggest or the widest variety of residents, right? Go to the library, don't go to New Seasons. Mm-hmm. Right? Because if you go to New Seasons, you're gonna get a very narrow range of respondents, but if you go to the library on a Saturday, you're gonna hit everybody. So it was a matter of just connecting with who what religious institutions are around, and who can we connect there. Facebook is probably the wealthy white vehicle. So what vehicles can we use to access other organizations and other populations? I think we're trying too hard to think of all of those details right now, but we all are a part of other communities other than this group right here. And we all know people who are in other communities other than this group right here. So if we just all connect, like we all know someone who rents, we all know someone who goes to a different religious institution than we do. So how do we reach out and connect? And that can be a quick conversation later once Councilor Fagin gives us $100,000.
Yeah, my question was actually more, is there data that already exists and plans that have recently been done where outreach has already been done, where we can take that data and put that toward your broad question and potentially even move your timeline that much faster by being able to more or less skip the first phase of asking the super broad questions and rather spend that time looking at the data that we already have available from the city from recent outreach and finding out whether or not the broad, like the answers to the broad questions from already existing data. This would also speak to the concern that there will be fatigue from the community and continuously being outreached to. And so we can.
Shannon, I think you're freezing up on us.
Honor them by using data. Just something I want you to question.
I don't think the data is there. I think it's a matter of the connections, and I think how we do round one of outreach. And was it Rachel who shared the creative ideas? Someone shared a link last time of all the creative ideas that we can do to do round one of outreach. And if we make it fun and exciting, I don't know, like people might be sick of surveys, but they might not be sick of drawing with chalk on a wall what their dreams are for the city. Okay, cool.
Okay, so folks, before we move on, and I want to move on, the timeline is really important because I want us all to at least have a good agreement as to what this looks like, because the city council might say this looks great, and then we're sort of committed to it. And so I agree with, I think we should throw in an extra month for the evaluation of the outreach of the first round. Okay, especially since it's over the holidays, I think that makes sense.
Brian, if I could make one recommendation,
absolutely,
that would be that council doesn't need this much detail.
Okay.
I think it's great for you all to align on what your goal is, but I think if you do like now through July 21st, that shows how you're going to get started. And then the next one could be August 21, bring consultant on board, and then deliver vision to council for approval in December of 2022. The details of it are going to change. The timelines are going to have to be flexible. If you're doing your first round of outreach and you run into some issue and it needs to go from November 21st to November of 2021 to January of 2022, that's what happens. So I don't think it has to be as detailed. I think a general timeline of we're going to begin now, and this is what we're going to do to July when we hope to get a consultant on board. And then, whenever the consultant starts, we're going to work with the consultant to help develop the timeline to deliver a vision to the city council by December of 2022. And it buys you a lot more flexibility. I don't think council, at least I don't expect, and I would think others would not expect that you would have this completely dialed in at this stage. But it's good to have this in your back pocket if any detailed questions came up.
Thank you. No, that's really helpful. Okay.
Brian, my only thing is it feels a little long. Like, can we trim it by like 4 to 6 months? And then if it takes us longer, it takes us longer, but.
Sure.
Where
would you want to do that?
I don't know. Just like 2023 sounds so far away.
That's why we're ending in 2022, Sarah.
I know, but like, it's going to be at least a month delayed. So I don't know.
Right. Well, also so I intentionally, when I was putting this together, and also if we don't need this level of detail, then I don't want to spend too much more time on this because I know we have other things we want to cover today. I intentionally made these phases longer than I thought we would need because I wanted to maintain that flexibility. And I think if we're focused on having a completed product to the city council by January 2023, really having it ready on our end of December 2022, I think that's a timeline that we can accomplish unless something really goes awry. But my intention with this is to say, here's what we're looking to do. This might change, but here's what we're looking to do.
Yeah, I guess that is 18 months if we really start in July. So that's good. It just feels so far away. Okay, now you can finish your presentation.
All right, perfect. We'll move forward. Okay, so we have that. And then we talked about the different requests we'd have of the council. Obviously funding. Let me move my.
And I thought we wanted 300,000. Did I just make that up, inflate that because I'm an accountant?
That was a number that was thrown around when we were talking with Shannon and Cece, but I don't know, because I don't know what things cost, and so I don't know what was actually put in. That's a request.
Well, 100,000 was requested.
I mean, I can tell you the zoo just did a strategic plan and it cost us 100,000, and we did not do near the community outreach. So I would think you would need more than that, but maybe we can ask CC what it cost last time or what THPRD spent on theirs.
And I didn't put a dollar figure in this because that's something we're leaning on staff for. I don't know what it costs here. So consultants help us various steps, costs that come with having virtual and live events. Participation incentives is something we all talked about, whether that be having daycare options, raffles, food available at events, those sorts of things. And translation services. Those are what I think are going to be probably the most costly things that we have. Did I miss anything in funding that's big?
The project manager.
Thank you. I'll make a note to add that after this.
Also, translation services are covered by the city.
Is that not assessed against our budget? I don't know how the city does its internal budgeting.
I will look into that.
Because I know different governments, I know, like for instance, at Clackamas County, whenever the DA's office wants something, it counts against us, even if it already existed somewhere. But I don't know how you all do that.
I'll look into that. But yeah, okay. Yeah, I'll check
it out. Help, right?
What's that?
The whoever we were going to use for the first round in lieu of the consultant.
Yeah, that was the other thing I was wondering about, whether we needed to account for that here.
Yeah, or account for that.
That definitely won't count against
City.
you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, my understanding is that does not count against us when it comes to funding.
Do we need to include any bureaucratic type stuff like actual production of the report and papers and copying fees? I don't know how.
I put that stuff into my budget already, Wade.
Okay.
So our $300,000 that we mentioned, Sarah, was on our end what the city we anticipate putting into it as far as the project manager, the like printing and all of that kind of stuff, and all of the ancillary stuff in addition to the consultant is where we came out to around 100 or 300,000.
Oh,
Yep.
okay.
Okay.
Can we define the project manager?
Sure. So in the past, there were dedicated staff members that their whole job was to work on visioning, and we don't have that any longer. The only person you have is me, and I have a full-time job too. So what we're trying to get is at least one designated staff member, which would be a project manager who would work with you to help with all the timeline and logistics and keeping things moving along, would take on some of the liaising back and forth between the consultant and Zen City, if we use Zen City, all of those sorts of things. So
this is just an accounting thing. If you not hire or get somebody new. It's an existing staff member that will be accounted for through this portion.
No, we've actually put in a request for a supplemental budget for an additional staff member that would serve specifically in that role.
Oh,
And would it be full or half time?
That I don't know. I think full-time, but I'm not entirely sure.
no, this is just the additional funding for VAC. There is probably separate funding for VAC itself, right? For the operation of the committee.
Yeah, but it's not a lot. It's several $1,000s, and that's mostly just to cover like ancillary costs.
It normally buys us dinner on Wednesday nights.
And limo rides to the meetings, right?
Right, limo rides, definitely. Especially during our virtual times.
Yeah.
Okay, and so then in addition to funding, I think we want their help, their participation. There may be events we have either virtual or live where city councilors and the mayor, be really nice to have them be there, and that might encourage other folks to participate too. And then finally, the approval of our plan or overview, or however we want to term what we're presenting to them now. Then this is the question that I had. And I remember we were talking about it at the retreat. We said we want to limit it to just a couple of questions because of one, our time constraints, but then two, folks on the council are going to want to talk about it as opposed to sort of quick answers. And so I think if we have questions that are sort of the higher level questions, the questions about, you know, what sort of end product do you want, what things like that, that's what we should be focusing on here. What do other people think?
Well, one thing we want to the council to do is be communicating with their staff on a regular basis about the vision. Do we want to say that in this? We want them to use the vision plan that we come up with.
Right, and I think that, you mean, right now we're talking about questions. Is that a question that?
Oh, it would fit better on the previous slide, but.
Right. So what I put a pin in that for just a minute, because I think that partially fits under participation. I think Jen had a question that she was going to add.
Yeah, I don't know if it goes here at the end of the presentation, but I think it would be interesting to ask council for specific groups that we should be reaching out to in the community.
Okay, yeah. Are there other questions that people have that we should add here?
Brian, I thought we were going to ask something about the use of partners around how did we word it? It was, I can't remember, but it was something about the, you know, do we have action items, like, or how do we collaborate with partners? Like, are they in charge of some action items? I can't remember that, but there was some discussion about it.
So we'd had, I remember what you're talking about, and if I'm remembering right, we had a discussion as to how we envision partners being used going forward. And that's something where we want feedback from multiple folks, both on the council and city staff. I'm trying to think what the question is that we want them to answer, because I think some of that's just going to be borne out by the information that we get.
Is this the one where it somehow relates to whether or not you partner with people who the city can directly influence whether or not they do anything about their action items versus people that we have no influence over whatsoever?
Well, we had that discussion, and I think we were all pretty unanimous that we should ask things about beyond just what the city has direct control over.
Okay.
And so maybe that's something we put in a different slide, but I don't think that it's a question we have for them so much as a part of our plan.
Do we already know what their priorities are?
That's a great question. What are your priorities for the community vision? Yeah, you're right. That's an important question to ask. Okay, other thoughts on questions before we jump back a slide? Because this is the last one. Okay, so then just to jump back, Wade, to address your point about them, I think that them interacting with their staffs, I think that just comes up with participation, and that's something that we can mention to that point.
Well, I think what I was trying to get at was we want their participation as part of the outreach, but we also want their commitment to use the final result. The commitment to the city that the vision is actually something that is a document that's going to be utilized for future decision making.
I see. That's helpful. Thank you. I'm writing that down.
That kind of falls under adopting the plan.
Yeah.
In the adoption of the plans, part of that adoption is the statement that we will utilize the plan and look to achieve the goals of the plan. The city has lots of plans, but I think you get that. So I think here in the approval of our plan, you're asking for two things. And I think this is kind of getting at what Wade was getting at. You want the approval of the plan for updating the vision, and you want the approval of the vision.
Thank you.
And I would use stronger language. I would say not just approval of the vision, but a commitment to use the vision. Maybe that's the same thing in council speak, but.
I like that, adding that.
But having said that, is there a forum for the council's input back? Like, do we have an opportunity to iterate with the council back and forth before
So
we
this is
fine tune?
my understanding of this, and Shannon and Mark hop in if I have this incorrect, is that Sarah and I will give the presentation, which should hopefully be brief. And then we'll have a conversation with the council about our questions and also any questions they might have and ideas that they have in relation to what we presented. Okay, so then considering everything we've seen here, and I really feel bad because I ate up too much time on this. Thinking about what this presentation as a whole, does anyone have any concerns that we haven't addressed yet? Or is there something that was just left out that needs to be put in?
I just was wondering, as you guys were having that discussion, it made me wonder about a question around if there was anything missing from the current plan that would make it easier for them to utilize it, because we're wanting them to commit to utilizing this plan as they move things forward. But is there anything in the format of this plan or any missing pieces of information that would make it easier for them to use it moving forward, because we could try and fill in those gaps?
Yeah, I agree with that. That's what I was trying to get at with the first question, but I think I can phrase it better to better capture what you're saying. Yeah.
I'm wondering, as I look at these questions, like Mark, maybe you can shed light on this, but I know that you and Mark Sansucci and Lacey Beatty have been on council for a while, but we also have 3 relatively new councilmen, obviously 2 really new, but also Laura has only been there for a couple of years. So they weren't there for the last visioning process. Are these questions ones that like half the council will be able to address, do you think?
It's hard to say. Right, I've had 2 months of meetings with Councilor Tivnan and Councilor Hassan. Councilor Hassan just went through a visioning process with the Park District, so she's familiar with visioning and how it works. She's sat in a tent and asked people questions, so I think she'll understand. She might not understand how Beaverton's has been utilized. It's a conversation though. I mean, and I think it's important to set the questions up to have a discussion around topics that you want to hear about. And if this is what you want to hear about, then I don't think one thing we're learning on council is there's not a lack of opinion and there's not a lack of discussion. So you'll get a lot of response, I think. So it's just a matter of making sure the question's focused on getting to an answer that or some ideas from individual counselors that you want to hear about.
Jen, I'm working with Abigail right now to try and get information to the counselors prior to the roundtable so that they can get up to speed, so to speak. I've been updating the website as well. I also created that infographic that Brian has in the PowerPoint for that reason, so that we can try and quickly get people on board with what has happened in the past, because I've had to learn that myself, and it takes
Shannon, you're frozen again.
So I think what she was saying is staff will do as best a job as they can to get all of council up to speed on what's going on. So we have regular briefings on topics that come before us. You can imagine the amount of information a new counselor needs to learn. It's drinking from a fire hose, and the counselors do really well. Both the new counselors are doing great, and staff does a really good job at working to make sure that they have the background information that's needed to be able to have a good conversation.
What time is the meeting on the 30th?
Roundtables typically start at 5:30 and go from 5:30 to 6:30, and then we have a bureau meeting at 6:30. So there's a hard stop on it. The downside of having a longer presentation at the beginning is you have less time for discussion. If you have a longer presentation, you'll get a little bit of conversation from council, but yeah, so you kind of weigh that when you're deciding, and that all depends on the output that you're looking for. Brian, you're muted. Brian, you're muted.
Thanks. Sorry about that. I'd say I think we've got about 8 or 9 slides. Hopefully we can get through that in 10 minutes or less, or about 10 minutes, I think would be about right, and then spend most of the time on discussion. So I think the last thing that I have, Councilor Fagin, is there anything that we're missing in our presentation that you think is going to be important for us to address, or something that we should be considering in advance of that?
Again, it just goes back to what you need to hear or want to hear. To me, the most important part of your of the presentation is the ask. And maybe you want a question of, do you have any concerns about putting this as a budget priority for next year? We understand the budget's going to be tight, but we think hearing from the community, especially after all the events that I outlined at the beginning of my presentation have happened, we want to hear from the community and our visioning advisory committee, right? Because this is a group that's different than any group that's done this before, which changes every year, but you're all going out for the first time, and you have a real intention of making sure you get to as many places as possible where people have not been heard from. And that's different, right? And that's a goal that you're holding up. I think you want to make sure, and Brian, you're an attorney, you understand, you want to make sure the close is good. It's a question about it's a question about why you need the money, why you think the budget is important, and is the council, are there any obstacles that the council sees in supporting it?
Great, thank you. That's really helpful. All right, so folks, we've taken a lot of your time tonight. I appreciate all of you being so participatory as usual. Before we close, is there anything for the good of the order that we should share?
I have one thing. On the 14th, which is Saturday, at 4 p.m., Sunrise Beaverton, the Young Democrats of Washington County, and 350.org Washington County branch are having a Green New Deal public forum. It's online, and the link is bit.ly/WACOGND, and I'll type it in the chat. But capital W, and then a lowercase a, capital C, and then GND is all capitalized. So it's a public forum about the Green New Deal. It's via Zoom. Oh, it's actually the 13th, sorry. That's the Saturday at 4 p.m. And love to have you guys there and anybody else that you know. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Anything else? All right, then. Thanks everybody for the great meeting.
Were we going to take a picture for your presentation?
That's a good idea, but now we're a little short. I think what I'll do is I'll hop on YouTube because all these are on YouTube. I noticed the other day they have between 5 and 7 views, so hopefully that ad money comes in soon. And I'll just find a freeze frame where everyone's at least kind of looking at the camera, and we'll clip that out, and I'll make sure that no one looks too bad. And if anyone does, it'll be me. That's what I'll do. I'll take the hit on that as long as we all have a good photo.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, everybody.
Brian, I move to adjourn.
Second. I don't think we have to do that, but yeah. All right. Anyway, I think we've lost quorum basically anyway, too. All right. See you all later.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.
Right.